Hello, welcome to another episode of the Silk and Steel podcast. I am now recording from my Bali courtyard. That's why you will hear dogs barking in the background and some machine tools. All the common sound in rural Indonesia. So I'm my because my after my wife got pregnant, she kicked out the dogs from the house, so they are now staying in the yard, and so I just moved into the yard to stay with them. But well, actually, welcome to the show, my guest, long returning repeat guest, Mr. Davide Melia, all the way from the remote border town of Mangsi, Yunnan, near the border, on the Chinese border near Myanmar.
Yeah.
Welcome to the show, Davide.
Thanks for having me back. It's always a pleasure.
It was always great to have you on.
Yeah.
And you are such a subject matter expert in this remote area of China. I mean, you
Uh,
are like on the southwest corner, right? Like this very little visited area of China, not even by domestic Chinese tourists. I visit you there last in 2019, like for the very
yeah.
first time in my life. Well, we had a blast for the water festival,
Yeah, it was good.
and this area actually is very intimately tied with caught up with the relationship between China and Myanmar because it's right on the border.
Yeah.
And right now Myanmar is in the news again because the recent coup. So there will be a lot to talk about. But I have prior to this I had wanted to bring you to the show for a long time to talk about the infamous Golden Triangle, the area of northern Myanmar that's on the border with China, Laos, and Thailand. And this area is infamous because it was one time the world's largest production base of opium and heroin. Oh, I mean,
Well,
in very recent history.
well,
And this was Go ahead.
the opium was grown in Shan and Kachin states, which are so like Dehong Prefecture, where I live, is on the border with Shan State, and the prefecture over Baoshan Prefecture is on the border with Kachin State,
So,
and
so for people who are not familiar with the geography in this part of the world, so in northern Myanmar is a patchwork of different ethnicities,
mm,
and the largest region in northern Myanmar is Kachin State and the San State, which both border China. And the Kachin state is named for the ethnic group Kachin, and the San state is named for the ethnic group San. But this is a name I believe the Burmese people call these people. They have their own names, Kachin would be called Jinpo inside
uh,
China,
that's
and San. Go ahead.
Um, well, you've got the Shan and the Kachin people. Now, the Kachin people, their name for themselves is Jingpo Wunpong, which means Jingpo Union. The Jingpo people are a like a confederacy, a long-standing confederacy of five different people. That is the Jingpo, the Lisu, and there's three others. But basically, yeah, they are a long-standing tribal
Yeah.
confederacy. They get put together as Kachin people in Myanmar, and the
Yes.
Shan people, similarly, their name for themselves in their own language is Dai people.
And
Um,
that's what they're known inside China, right, by their own self-ethnic name.
Well,
So
yeah, there's different geographical subgroups, but overall they know themselves as the Dai people. Um, So you've got Derhong Dai, Sichuan Bana Dai, and so on. This is like a geographical identifier, but
Yeah,
also historically speaking, this part of Yunnan and northern Myanmar was dominated by Dai peoples, kingdoms, principalities. Um, the Dai people at one point even had an empire which ruled over most of Yunnan.
yeah.
So,
I mean it's the area of northern Myanmar to this day, right? There's the Thai speaking people. There was a large scale migration of Thai speaking people from southwestern China over 1,000 years ago
oh yeah,
to over all over Southeast Asia. Some of them made it as far as Thailand. That's where they founded Siam and later modern day Thailand. Some of them made it to northern Myanmar and pushed further west to north, what is now northeast India, right? The kingdom, the Assam was the kingdom of Ahom, and Ahom kingdom was founded by Thai-speaking people, but they adopted Hinduism and incorporate a lot of the Indian culture once they reached that area. And but what I want to talk about today is kind of the history of this region and how it became developed, how it became developed with the help of CIA, became the world's top most opium and heroin producing region before that title was overtaken by Afghanistan under NATO occupation,
yeah,
and which is also has U.S. finger in it. So, but
yeah.
this is a very little known history. People, a lot of people may know about Golden Triangle and know about the drugs, but a lot of people don't know how that history developed, because the opium, it was actually not indigenous to this region, right? As you mentioned. So we're gonna go back from the beginning. We're gonna give you the whole rundown and to the modern day Myanmar and how that ties into the current political landscape of Myanmar and the current struggles. So um, to help me, we have Davide, who has been living in Mangsi for how many years now, Davide?
On and off, I've been living here. This is the 10th year I've been here.
Mm,
Um,
wow.
I've lived here. This year it will be 7 years. But so in the last 10 years, I've been living here for 7 years. Basically, I've gone back to Australia to you know go to my grandfather's funeral, um, go to my mother's 60th birthday, this kind of thing. But for the most part, I've been living and working here for the past
Oh
10
yeah,
years.
sorry, my bad. As a host, I forgot to introduce you for the people who may have joined the subscriber base of Silk and Steel more recently. So
Yeah,
Davide is Australian from
Perth.
Perth, Australia, and you came to China initially to teach English at the Dehong Teachers College.
Yeah,
That's where you made a lot of local contact, and then you stay. Now you are married, you are settled there,
yeah,
and you have lived there many years, and you have many contacts both inside Yunnan, China, but also across the border in northern Myanmar. So
yeah.
that's why you bring a very interesting perspective into this discussion. So I wanted to, and originally when we were planning the show, I said I was going to start with, around the 1949 at the end of the Chinese Civil War, when the KMT got kicked out of China and a portion of remnant KMT escaped to northern Myanmar. But you wanted to actually go even further to the history, how opium production was introduced to this region, right?
Oh, absolutely. Well, historically, of course, from the Silk Road and so, well, like opium has been known to Chinese civilization for a very long time. It's mentioned in certain famous traditional Chinese medicine treatises and so on.
But it's always imported. It wasn't natively
Yeah, no,
grown in
it
China.
wasn't. The Dutch actually, well, actually, it started with the Portuguese. The Portuguese started like this is like your large scale importation. First, you had the
Actually,
Sorry.
Actually, yes, the Colombian exchange play a large part because the gateway drug to opium was actually tobacco, because because traditionally when opium was imported to China, people took it orally as medicine,
Yeah,
right?
totally. Or they
Traditional Chinese
dissolved it in
medicine.
vinegar and wine and stuff like that.
Yeah, so you can't actually ingest too much opium orally because that will kill you. People actually take opium like in large doses as a painless way to commit suicide,
Well,
right? Like,
especially if you're dissolving it in alcohol, because both of those are central nervous system depressants, and
yes,
both of them will basically depress your breathing and slow your heart rate. And if you mix too much and you ingest that orally, yeah, that's a pretty good way to die.
yeah.
Like
So
you,
in traditional Chinese medicine, opium was always taken in very small portions for its medicinal
yeah,
value
as
of
as a cough
as little.
suppressant or whatever.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes. So it's never meant to be taking large quantity. But what happened with the Colombian exchange was the Portuguese and the Spanish, they introduced tobaccos from the Americas to Southeast Asia, where it's been picked up by the Chinese migrants in the region because the Chinese have a large trading network all throughout Southeast Asia for hundreds of years. And so then these Chinese merchants then brought this new crop back from Southeast Asia to Chinese mainland, where the smoking habit spread. And then the Portuguese, it's either Portuguese or Dutch, they invented the way to basically roll the opium
into
in.
balls.
Yes, so you can smoke it. So you like that kind of revolutionized the opium consumption patterns because whereas before if you take too much opium orally you will die. Now you can quote unquote safely smoke away.
Well,
And good.
it was about 1500. The Portuguese, but basically started opium smoking around that time. Um, and then they actually started getting opium into Indian opium, by the way. Like the opium growing areas in India were Bengal and Bihar, and the Portuguese started shipping it into China through Macau. Macau's been Portuguese. Well, it was controlled by the Portuguese for a long
Yeah,
time, and that was their routes into China through Macau. And that was the 1600s. So along with tobacco was also opium. Like they kind of, as you say, they kind of went together as a recreational drug. Ah,
yeah,
but it says, from what I can tell, the Dutch were the ones who introduced. Oh, here's a tobacco pipe. You can roll it up in a ball. You can roll your opium up in a ball, put it in with some tobacco, and smoke it through a pipe the same way you already smoked tobacco. It was the Dutch who did that about 100 years later, around 1700.
yeah. So that's when the Dutch came in. They took advantage because after the Dutch, this was a time when because the Portuguese crisis of succession because the Portuguese king foolishly led an expedition into North Africa and get himself killed, and the Spain basically annexed Portugal, and And then during that time, uh, Dutch was fighting a war against Spain for their own independence, so the Dutch then also waged a war on all the colonial position of the Spanish crown, including the former Portuguese colonies. So we're talking about Malacca, right?
Yeah.
And parts of Indonesia, and so the Dutch came. They kicked out the Portuguese from Malacca. They took over the Spice Islands. They eventually established foothold in on the Java Island. They established Fort Batavia, which would later develop in today's Jakarta. And so while Dutch was establishing its colonial empire in what then was called the Dutch East Indies,
Mm.
they took over the opium trade. Yeah,
Yeah, that was around 1700. This is opium from India, and it wasn't just going to China; it was also going to the islands of Southeast Asia, as you say. Like Malacca, um, Batavia. I'm not sure offhand if this is true or not, but at the time, Batavia was one of the biggest or the biggest commercial centers in the world as far
yeah.
as sheer volume of imports and exports and money that was
It
passing
was
through there.
outside in the world, is outside of mainland China and Japan, right? Because back then, the sheer volume of trade within China is huge, but for the value outside of China, in terms of European dominated trade, Batavia was one of the largest ports.
And this is something like, okay, so we'll go from the Dutch. Now this is around 1700. The Dutch started mass exporting opium from India around Southeast Asia, including China. Um, and in 1729, the Yongjing Emperor, he ruled from 1678 to 1735. Toward the end of his time as emperor in 1729, he prohibited the smoking of opium. He also prohibited the sale of opium. And at that time, so basically, you had a prohibition of opium
Yeah,
in
because it was
China.
around that time, even this was at the height of the Qing dynasty power in China, the so-called High Qing. The opium consumption already became a problem among the upper class elite because people took on as a kind of a luxury consumption, basically. Like it's like now, just like how rich people now do coke, right? Back then, rich Chinese gentlemen did opium. Yeah, but
Yeah.
Yongzhen. So the side effect of opium by then was already well established and well known.
Well,
So that's why
it had
go ahead.
been in the Chinese pharmacopoeia for a very long time, maybe over 1,000 years. So they knew, yeah, this shit is powerful. If you take too much, you will stop breathing and you will die. Like, as you say, like, yeah, they knew what it did. Like, they weren't ignorant about the effects that opium could have on people's physiology, for sure. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah, but as a consumption, this was a new pattern of kind of elite consumption. When the opium became smokable, right? In when we can be smoked through pipes, and that kind of widened its base. It evolved from like a traditional Chinese medicine to actually consumable goods,
Yeah, yeah, totally.
drug of recreation.
I mean,
And go ahead.
I was going to say, there's a lot of things in the Chinese pharmacopoeia which, like like opium was in the Chinese pharmacopoeia. Um, Cannabis was in the Chinese pharmacopoeia. However, the recreational use of these drugs was always um, indicted, not prohibited, but indicted. Like, it was seen as being a very low class sort of thing. At times, opium became quite fashionable. Cannabis never did become fashionable as a drug of abuse or recreation in China at all. Um,
Yeah, well, I mean, one part of it, in the beginning, it was a recreational drug for the elite. Also because it was expensive, it had to
exactly.
be imported, right? So it's like it's like doing coke, right? And then but what the British did later though
Yeah.
is they started to industrial farming opium, and they produce opium in such an industrial scale after the British took over India as a colony that they dominated the trade, and then they depress the opium price to the point where
Everyone could get high, yeah.
yes, it can be it became affordable to even the common laborers. And then British actually wage an active campaign of drug pushing inside China. They work with like drug dealers inside China to promote their drugs, as safe and cheap, reliable, and so they spend years cultivating like the drug market inside China until they basically that became the number one cash crop of the British Empire because
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
I'd like to go into that a little bit now. So
okay,
in 1729, Yuan Zhong, sorry, hang on a second.
it's okay. Take your time.
Yongzheng, Yongzheng Emperor banned opium consumption or opium sale in China, except under license for use as medicine. So it was pretty much the exact same situation as prohibition in the US with alcohol. Like you needed to have a medicinal license, and so there was a lot of ways around this edict prohibiting its smoking or its sale. However, that edict still did do a lot to reduce its use in China. Okay, and then in 1750, in that year, the British East India Company took over Bengal and Bihar. So they were like the big opium growing areas in India. And in that year, the British started mass selling it from Calcutta to their port in Calcutta to China. And then
And I like
by,
to interject and remind people the reason Dutch and British all wanted to sell opium to China is because at this time in 18 in late 1700s and early 1800s, China was the world's largest economy.
hmm,
Even
oh
as
yeah,
late as yeah, even as late as 1830s, just on the eve of Opium War, China produced like 33% of the world's industrial output. I mean, like it was China was Chinese economy was gigantic back then, so that's why all these Europeans, since Marco Polo and Columbus, are trying to find their way to
to
China to
muscle
trade.
in, yeah.
Yes, and but the best way they found to make money in China was through drugs. That's what they did.
Well, a big issue for for the European colonialists was China wanted or needed very little from them. Um, the main thing that the Chinese wanted from other countries was silver, because silver at that time was the reserve metal of Chinese
It
currency.
was
Like
Chinese
every,
currency. It was China. It was yeah. China was a silver-based currency economy, and
yeah,
the reason also China didn't need it very little from outside world because China itself it was a huge continental-sized economy. You already produce everything you need, and
yeah,
this was also was a time before, I emphasize, before industrial revolution in Europe. So actually, okay, after a little bit technical difficulties, we're back. So
Okay.
I was mentioning earlier, before the Industrial Revolution that happened in England in the early 1800s, European manufacturers didn't have any cost advantage to the Chinese manufacturers because China
Yeah.
could produce everything it needs. It didn't need goods that was shipped over long distance, all the way from England.
Yeah.
You may need some spice from the Spice Islands, but that's about it.
Well, it wasn't so much a question of need, I feel like. Um, it was more, okay, we want this, we want that, we want the other thing, but we don't need it for our economic development or, for the purposes of the ruling Qing power or anything like that. So, and even with silver, as I said, they always needed more silver because it was the basis of their currency, their
Yeah,
whole economy.
because what happened was during Ming Dynasty, China was the first to invent paper, and China was also the first to be on paper-based currency. But during the Yuan Dynasty and Ming Dynasty, the Chinese imperial government got a little bit crazy with money printing, so they caused hyperinflation. And what happened was the paper currency collapse. The country went back to metal based system,
Yeah,
and silver became the currency of choice. But China didn't have produced enough silver because at this time, as I mentioned, China was the world's largest economy and growing, and the silver mine in China was just not enough, cannot keep up with the demand for new currency. So they had to import a lot of silver from abroad. So initially
yeah,
was the discovery of silver mine in Japan, so that helped. And then later, when the Spanish took over Americas, they discovered silver mine in Bolivia and Mexico and Peru. And then that actually it surged the trade with China, the silver flow from Americas, that actually allowed financial stability of the Spanish colonies, enabled Spanish to
yeah.
stay in the Americas. I think
Well,
they did a
uh,
study that showed 50% of the silver produced in the Americas since the Spanish colonization ended up in China. From
hmm,
1500s all the way to 1800s, up to half of the silver produced in New World ended up shipping to China because the Spanish they wanted to trade with China, but they weren't allowed because they were, also doing some pillaging, and so they weren't allowed to trade directly on Chinese mainland. What they did is that they set up a new trading post in Manila in the Philippines, and they welcomed the Chinese merchants who
yeah,
ran the blockade to come to the Philippines to trade. And so that's how the silver from the Americas ended up going to the Chinese mainland. And then the Chinese goods like tea and porcelain and silk flew to the Spanish colonies and back to Europe.
yeah. This is something that I we always hear when you're studying like that time that Chinese society, the main source of adventurism was in Chinese society was always the merchants. Up until very recently, that you know a Chinese merchant would go anywhere, you know, even like say a lot of um, a lot of merchants from East China came, West China, like what's now Yunnan, Guizhou, places like this, was considered to be like this wild west, like this scary place. But in Western China, you had this incredible amount of silver. Like Yunnan, until pretty recently, was one of the main domestic sources for silver. in
Yes. Yes.
China.
In fact, in the Ming and the Qing dynasty, one of the biggest driver for development of Yunnan being the province, for people not familiar, Yunnan is a province to the southwest of China, in the southwest corner. To the north, it borders Tibet. To the southwest, it borders Myanmar, and southeast, it borders Vietnam and Laos. And it has been a borderland region, but what actually drove the development of Yunnan and also more migration of Han Chinese from interior China to Yunnan was mining. Was
Yeah,
mining, like I mentioned, was silver, tin, and
copper,
I forgot. Yes, silver, tin, copper. They were like the main economic stay of
a lot
Yunnan.
of gold.
Yes,
At one time, there was a lot of jade as well. Yunnan has long since been mined out of jade, so
yeah,
now the Chinese jade trade relies on Xinjiang for mutton
yeah,
fat jade
Myanmar.
and Myanmar. Exactly the same areas we're talking about when we talk about the opium trade.
Yeah.
Um,
So
and
so let's
the
get
two
back to the drug.
yeah,
Let's
as
not get back to
as
the drug.
as I was going to say, the two trades are really closely linked together, especially in that time period that you're going to get to eventually.
Yes. Like Yunnan was, like I mentioned, was a border town, and it was the Han Chinese migration to Yunnan really started in the Ming Dynasty.
Hmm.
Originally was settled by soldier farmers, and then
Yeah,
then it's the miners. It's the people,
uh,
like a lot of single bachelor men who couldn't find better prospects in inner China. They came to Yunnan to work as miners, and
in
many of them then settle, marry local women, and form like
yeah
new communities. Yeah.
in in one case, you've got Tengchong in Baoshan Prefecture. That was the first significant amounts of, and that's like that's been a center of Han and Hui people in Yunnan since I think the 1500s.
Yeah,
Eventually,
since the Kublai Khan, well, Hui Muslims have been in Yunnan since the Kublai Khan's conquest of Yunnan.
yeah,
Right?
um,
A lot of Central Asian Muslims came with the Mongol army and they settled in, and especially when the Mongols privileged them over, the locals and also Han Chinese. In fact, the first governor of Yunnan during the Mongol rule
was
was a Central Asian Muslim who
exactly,
originally
yeah,
came from Bukhara, which is today's Uzbekistan, right?
yeah.
And he founded a long, like he and his line kind of rule over large part of Yunnan, and in fact, when the Ming
That was
Dynasty
that was
finally
that was the kingdom of Dali. The previous kingdom of Dali got rolled by the
by the
Mongols,
Mongols,
and they
yes,
put
by the
and they put that guy's dynasty, and that they stayed in power until the 1700s or something like
They
that.
oh no, they didn't. They stayed in power until the Ming Dynasty overthrew the Mongols.
Okay.
So the Mongols came and they so the Yunnan was actually one of the last Mongol held out in China,
Yeah.
because Ming Dynasty very soon took over most of the Chinese heartland. And then the Mongol emperor, the last Mongol emperor, fled Beijing into Inner Mongolia, and then in the other corner of China that was still ruled by the Mongols was Yunnan because it was so remote, and so
Yeah.
so eventually the Ming Dynasty sent in troops into Yunnan to conquer this last Mongol holdout, and in doing so they destroyed um, like they captured one of the descendants of this Muslim, the Muslim governor of Yunnan, and this is a boy by the name, later giving the name Zheng He. Right, he was castrated, sent into palace as a eunuch, and eventually he became a confidant of the Ming prince, who would later become the Ming emperor, and then the Ming Emperor would send his confidant Zheng He as the admiral, leading
Yeah,
a Indian treasure fleet all over Indian Ocean, right, all the way to Africa.
yeah.
Yeah, but
And
that's a different story. We
Zing,
digress a little bit.
yeah, just a little.
This is
Yeah,
kind of, yeah, because Yunnan is just has a fascinating history. But let's get back to the drugs.
yeah.
This is a drug episode.
Well, that's our starting point anyway. The way it works.
Yeah,
Yeah. As I was going to say, Chen Long. Okay, so basically we were at like about 1767. Um, the import of opium from by the British East India Company, which was like the commercial arm of the British Empire. It got up to 2,000 chests of opium a year by 1767. A few decades later, in 1793, they had a monopoly. Like they were the only ones who were allowed to sell. So the British,
I just want to interject for a second because opium became the biggest moneymaker of the British China trade,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and in like I remember when studying world history in U.S. in high school, we were still taught one of the reason, supposedly the reason the Europeans demand of China is because China's market was closed. So really the European war, one of the reasons for European war against
Free
China was
trade, yeah.
free trade. But what they really meant free trade is free trade of opium because that was the biggest goods that British
Well,
was selling
that's
into
that's
China.
that's the nice thing that, like, as we discussed before, like there wasn't that much that China needed or wanted from the British at that point. And that's the
Yeah.
really nice thing about addictive drugs like tobacco and opium is once to this day, like, you
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 have a
you
captive
have
market. You have a captive audience.
the product creates its own market. Yeah, by virtue of the fact that it is fit, like both drugs are physically addictive. Like once you have them, you need them, and if you
Yeah,
don't get them, like you can get sick and die. Like
yeah,
not from tobacco so much,
but
but
opium.
opium opium withdrawals can kill people, like the
Yeah,
same as alcohol.
yeah.
Like the body
Goes
goes
into
through
shock.
physiological changes, and once you have that habit, if you don't keep on getting that drug, the changes that your body makes can kill the body. So yeah, it's a great way to create a market, basically.
Yeah, and
Um,
the British were very good at what they were doing because they have all these embedded they embedded themselves with the local Chinese dealers, the distributors, but they also learned to grease the wheel by bribing all the Qing dynasty officials to turn the other way because officially the drug opium is still banned. Uh,
yeah,
it's but even the opium consumption is have to be supposedly have to be strictly regulated, but in effect on the ground, because British was bribing all these officials on the local level to look the other way, opium
yeah,
consumption and opium smuggling became rampant.
and that led to Qianlong Emperor. He banned opium completely in 1799. He said, "No more no more medicinal licenses, nothing." Because that was the way, that was one of the big ways that the British got around the ban, was basically the earlier edict against opium had that exception under license for use as medicine, and they basically, that's how they got around the ban of smoking or selling opium, was, oh yeah, yeah, it's all for medicine, like we and then that they would just bribe some local official to issue a license to be like a medicine selling company or whatever. And so
Yeah,
that got so out of hand, as you said, that by 1799, Qianlong Emperor said, "Nah, it's no, we don't
no
need opium
loophole.
as a medicine. no more fucking opium. We're done. Like, no. And basically he tried to just stop it completely
Yeah.
because, as you say, it became such a huge problem. Um,
Yeah, it got to the
and
point
yeah,
where like even the army, the people in the banner army, the Manchu army bannermen were all smoking opium. People joke that they carry two guns, right? They carry a musket, but they also carry a pipe, opium pipe.
yeah, yeah. Um, and this is we get to the start of the 19th century now, and
Yep.
now this is where we get morphine. Like morphine
Mm,
was discovered in 1803. As so many of these stories go, this started with a German chemist. He got opium paste. He dissolved it in acid, and then he neutralized it with a basic solution, ammonia. And the leftover product was the alkaloid, the which is morphine. And this is really funny that like at the time people thought, oh, opium was this dirty drug that will kill you, but morphine is really reliable. It lasts for longer because it's really pure. It's more safe.
yeah.
So,
Safe.
and this is the history of opioids, like drugs derived from opium. That every time they come up with a new one, they go, oh, now because they make them stronger. They go, oh, this is more reliable. We can more reliably measure a dose. It's safer because there's no more guesswork involved. Now, but every time you go from like opium paste to morphine to heroin to what's diamorphine? No, that's heroin. Sorry. Yeah, so morphine, diamorphine. So like heroin is just like a further refining of morphine. And this is the big history of opioid drugs. Really, like they keep on making more refined versions, and every time they think, "Oh, this is going to solve all of the problems that we have with getting opium paste, rolling it into a ball, and smoking it with tobacco from a pipe." Oh dear. And this is also around the time that the Americans started getting in on the opium trade. There
Yes.
was a
In
an
fact,
American. You
the
go.
Americans, for in the early when United States achieved its independence, one of the biggest urgent tasks was to find a new market because it was blockaded by British from the British Commonwealth, from the British Empire trade network. So they, there's a solution was to trade with China because China was still then the world's largest market, and United States actually tried to sell all different goods to China. First, they tried ginseng because ginseng grows in the wilds in the United States,
Hmm.
and they were sending tons of them over to China because again, ginseng is valued as a Chinese medicine. But what happened was the U.S. they sent so much ginseng that depressed the price of ginseng, then it became not worthwhile to ship it all the way across Pacific. So then they
Yeah.
tried um, like otter pelts and the fur seal pelts, and they actually ran it. So they would go the American traders. They would go to Pacific Northwest, right, and uh, buy up otter pelts in the area, and then ship it across Pacific to China. It caused such a disruption to the other. I mean, by the time the otter population in Northwest Pacific Northwest almost got wiped out at this point,
Hmm.
and then they moved to fur seals. They were sending in like 4 million force seal pelts over to China, like with like either annually or within a couple of years.
Yeah.
So that greatly reduced the seal population in South Americas.
A-
And and one of the one of the stopping points, one of the counting ground was Falkland Island, right? So that U.S. actually got into some kind of claim with the British over Falkland Island because that was one of the places that ships stopped to hunt seals for selling to China, and then they after they're running out of otters and the seals, they went to Hawaii and they start cutting down sandalwood forest to ship all the
Yeah.
sandalwood, and that also started kind of the European colonization of Hawaii. That's when all the U.S. businessmen and British businessmen start moving to Hawaii, starting their plantations, and then when they pretty much caused like environmental depredation everywhere, they finally decided, you know what, the British is doing well with opium. Let's try that. And and they found a reliable part, but the British monopolized the opium in India, right? Because that was one of the main growing regions of opium was
Well,
a British
well,
India.
that's the thing. The British India Company had the monopoly on Indian. The British India Company had the monopoly on opium from India from yeah, no, 1793. Okay,
Yeah, from the
and
time they
then there
took
was,
over
there was
the continent, yeah,
but
basically.
the other center of opium production at that time was Turkey, and in
Yes.
that case as well, the British had the British Levant Company, and they also had a monopoly on the opium that was being produced in Turkey as well. So you had the British East India Company and the British Levant Company, and between them, they basically controlled, at that time, they controlled the world opium trade.
Yeah,
And
and this.
all the Americans, sorry, all the
Go ahead.
Americans who they had to get their opium from the Brits. And it's funny that you mentioned the fur trade because the Astors of New York City, that the Astor family, they're very rich and influential even today. Their family fortune started with fur trading and opium smuggling in
Oh yeah,
1816.
almost
John,
most of the old money in US, all the New England money elite, they all made their money in China trade, aka opium smuggling. and
well,
and we're talking about like the Forbes family, right?
yeah, the
His fortune
Astors.
started, yeah, the and then we have who, by the way, John Kerry is related to.
Oh,
And then we have the Roosevelts. FDR, Franklin Roosevelt's grandfather, Warren Delano. Well, FDR, the D in FDR is Delano.
is
You know,
Delano, yeah.
yeah, that's from the last name of FDR's maternal grandfather, William Delano, and Delano went to or Warren Delano. I need to check, but they all got started in opium smuggling to China. That's how the seed money for American Industrial Revolution was made. It was made in the opium
Yeah.
money, and the Americans work with a Chinese merchant at the time. This guy who is known.
You covered him before.
Yes,
He
Hokwa.
was the richest
Hokwa.
man in the world at that time. Yeah,
Yes,
Haokwa, yeah. Hokwa.
yeah. Hokwa was so rich. He was, everyone knows Rothschild, right? The Jewish banking family who dominated banking industry in Europe. But he was at the time Hokwa in 1830s. His net worth is 5 times that of Nathaniel Rothschild of England.
Yeah.
Um, that's how wealthy he is. He was so
He
he thought, okay, well, the British are making a killing in opium. I want to get into that. So he worked with Americans. because at this time, the United States, this the war. Okay, so the War of 1812 broke out with the British, right? All the American merchant ships in China are kind of stuck because they can't they can't go back to the East Coast because of the British blockade. So Hokwa came up with a solution for them. It's like, look, rather than you going back and forth between U.S. and China, here, let me give you some money. You can take the money and go to Turkey and get some Turkish opium, and I will make sure you can get your ships through the custom. And
Yeah,
Hokwa do
I was wrong on that. The British didn't have a monopoly on Turkey. They just controlled the Levant company owned something like
yeah,
50%, but
yep, yep,
there was still plenty of leftover for the Americans and others to buy and sell
yes, yes,
themselves.
yes. Because at that time it was under Ottoman Empire, right? And then the Americans found an opening, so they went to Turkey, with the Chinese seed money, and about from Hokwa, and then they will because they have Hokwa. The reason we work with the Americans because Hokwa didn't have his own fleet. Whereas Americans they can go Uh, wherever in the world. And before the war with the British, Americans could even sail to London to sell to London directly. So what Hokwa would do is he would have the American traders to carry his tea on consignment to go ship to England to sell directly to the British market, bypass the British India monopoly. And then during 18 War of 1812, the war between U.S. and Britain, uh, Hokwa says, okay, we have to figure out another gig. Then he gave Americans the money to go to Turkey to buy opium, and then bring it back to Canton or Guangzhou, right? And Hokwa would do
Yeah,
things because at the time Guangzhou experienced famine, so the government, the Qing government, were local government in Guangzhou were actually encouraging foreign merchants to bring to import rice from abroad, right? So Hokwa would like have the Americans to have ship rice into Guangzhou, which then the American ships will be waved through. But on the bottom bunk of the ship, they will store opium, right? So
and
within
this
the
is
ship, yeah. Go ahead.
I wanted
Go
to
ahead.
mention this. You mentioned the link between American merchants and Hokwa and Turkey. There's two particular Americans who were involved in that trade. You had a guy called John Cushing.
Yes.
He worked for the James and Thomas H. Perkins Company. They were from Boston.
Yep.
They got their he got his wealth from moving Turkish opium to Guangzhou from to Canton,
Yep.
and that
Yep.
was also true for John Jacob Astor, the big the patriarch of the Astor family. He
Yep.
had a company called the American Fur Company. They they bought tons and tons of Turkish opium, and then they
Yep.
smuggled it into Canton. Um, but later on, Astor got out of selling opium to China, and he found it easier, I suppose, to just sell directly to the English. But yeah, you've got I think at first, the Americans who got into the opium trade, they would buy from the British and then they would smuggle it into China. But then,
Mm-hmm.
like into the 1810s, you had Cushing and Astor who went, "Hang on, this is a much more profitable way to do things.
Yeah.
Um,
And also because the
if we
1812, the
go
war.
from Turkey,
Yeah. Also because 1812, the
yeah,
war between U.S. and Britain, so they couldn't go dock in the British ports anymore. So that's when
yeah,
they got into business with Hokwa, and both
that's
these families have very close tie with Hokwa. They became kind of like
Yeah.
basically whole class proxies to to do the tea opium trade. Yeah, tea for opium. And
Well,
so
Cushing started in 1812. So I guess at first, Boston, there was a lot of commercial links between Boston and England, and then 1812 happened, and
yep,
Cushing would have had to go. Well, that's not going to work anymore. The Charles Cabot way of buying from the Brits and selling to the Chinese isn't going to work anymore. Oh, okay, I'll go from the Turkish to the Chinese with Chinese venture capital, and the
yep,
same for John Jacob Astor as well.
yep, yep. And same
Uh,
for John Forbes and yeah, which who started the Forbes fortune, um,
yeah.
and Delano. Yep, yep.
So this is this is a who's who of um, East
American
Coast
industrialists.
US
Yeah.
dynastic wealth,
Yes. Yes. Um,
and it's
and
all
and so yeah, yeah. So let's uh, I'm sorry, not
move on.
William Delano, Warren Delano. That's the grandfather of FDR. He made his fortune from smuggling opium to Guangzhou,
Yeah,
and FDR owe a lot to his grandfather because FDR he didn't have a real job before he became president. He relied basically on this dynastic opium wealth to put
yeah.
himself in
He
presidency.
was he
Yeah.
was just he was just like an adventurer, basically, right?
Yeah, yeah. He was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and that silver spoon was financed by originally the opium wealth.
Yeah.
And yeah, yeah. And in fact, FDR they through his grandpa Warren Delano, they have a large mansion in the Victoria Peak in Hong Kong.
Oh
But yeah,
yeah,
so
you
yes,
we
they have
talked
a
about that
long
before.
they have a long ties. But anyway, we kind of sidetrack and went tangent.
Again.
Let's get back to the drugs. Let's get back to the
Yeah.
drug.
Um so basically like the reason why we're having to go through China is this is really a history of how northern Myanmar became so
Yeah,
big on um, opium production, basically.
yeah. But
Now,
prior to Opium War, right, the most major production of opium is either from British India or from Turkey,
yeah, I
and
mean,
that main source, right, shipping by either by British and Americans into
s-
China.
sometimes people mention that there was already there was opium in northern Myanmar from the 1700s at least, and of course it was known to the Chinese pharmacopoeia, so it wasn't a completely new thing in Myanmar or China before the 1700s and 1800s. What
Yeah.
those what the Portuguese and the Dutch and the British brought with them was like this
But
flooding the country with just tons and tons and tons of this stuff. Like previously, opium was really like a medicinal plant, and it
before
wasn't.
it was a niche market, right? Before, like as I mentioned, opium you cannot because you cannot take in large quantities orally; it will
Yeah,
kill you. So
and there's
before the opium production, if any, that existed in northern Myanmar, it was very small scale. It's like farmers they will plant rice, but they maybe have some patch of opium on the side to make a little bit like extra cash income, but uh, it wasn't like a major or staple crop in the region.
well, um, see the thing with Chinese medicine is like it's all based on like at least your herbal medicines. There's actually tiers of safety and usefulness in Chinese medicine. And the thing about opium was it was part of the Chinese pharmacopoeia. However, it was in that most dangerous and sparingly used. So some
Yes.
some Chinese medicinal plants, you'll find them growing everywhere. They're really commonly grown, really commonly used, because they're more broadly useful for one thing, and for another thing, their physiological effects, they do less harm. Like, there's some plants that you can't really overdose on. Like, so say cannabis. Like, at one point, cannabis was in that category of the safest of Chinese medicinal drugs. But cannabis basically became very, very much unpopular for different reasons later on. But opium in the Chinese pharmacopoeia was always that really, it was seen as being a dangerous drug. It was
Yeah.
really, its uses weren't that wide. It wasn't
Yeah.
that commonly used. In
Yes.
that it wasn't a tonic or something like that. It was like, if someone has severe pain, like,
Yeah. What happened?
and
What the British did was they, you know, start to farm it on an industrial scale. They made the price affordable to the working
everyone,
class people, and in doing so, it created a huge market, right? And like I think the some according to some European missionary accounts, some parts of China, they think somewhere from like a third to like 50% of the adult male population was addicted
was
to the
smoking.
opium.
Yeah.
And that's
Um,
a huge number, and that's why also why it's a hugely lucrative trade when you have like you are selling into the world's largest economy
yeah.
with this huge captive market,
Yeah.
who are addicted to your goods. I mean, it was that's why the British was willing to go to war for it. I
Mm.
mean, it was so good for them.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
okay, so let's bring it closer to Myanmar.
Yeah. We're moving in this direction slowly.
Okay.
That Okay. So 1830, basically, Jardine Matheson took over from the British East India Company. Okay. So at
Yes.
this
Yes.
at this time, the British East India Company was no longer had an absolute monopoly. But
There
that,
was a time when so initially British East India Company had a monopoly on all the trade,
yeah,
including opium trade to China. But by early 1800, they lost the monopoly, and even before that, they were kind of being out competed by these so-called country traders, uh, like the Jardine Matheson. And the William Jardine is an interesting case because he started as a doctor for the East India Company, and as a doctor, as a staff, he was entitled on British East India Company's ships. He was entitled to have a space, a storage space for himself, and he used that storage space, for his consignment of opium to
he
ship to
just
China.
packed it full of drugs. Yeah,
Yeah, that's how he accrued his initial capital is by his using his position within British East India Company,
and that's
and then he started off on his own, forming his own trading company. And after the especially after the British East India Company monopoly kind of expired,
yeah.
he got into a big time. Like Jardine,
He was well positioned. He actually got the opium monopoly, or basically the opium trade, from India directly from the British East India Company, because
yeah,
he was already tied into the British East India Company. So,
yeah,
as you say, like, he started off with them, so he was in exactly the right spot.
yeah,
Um,
and also at the time, he was actually one of the chief proponent for the Opium War, because at the
yeah,
time there was still divided opinion in the British Parliament. Like, should we really? go to war for selling drugs, right? There's still some like hand wringing among like the kind of the
the
Christian.
liberals of the time.
Yeah, yeah. It's like, oh, should we really? But Jardine, William Jardine, he traveled back to London. He bought up all these newspaper, like having all these newspaper printing like pro-war story like against China. Like this is a very mod. That's why Opium War is a very modern war. It's a very modern story. Like this is basically a drug lord slash oligarch went back to London, spread his money, buying up all these media, and then wage a media campaign for war, and
Yeah,
all kind of bogus reasons. Oh, like yeah, we are. The British honor is being insulted in China. They call us barbarians. How intolerable,
yeah.
right? They
Around that
open the
time, the British made their first attempts at actual diplomacy with Qianlong, and yeah, basically
oh,
it
that's in
was
1790s. Yeah, that's in
yeah
1790s.
that was a bit earlier then, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
But from what I can tell, at that time, that was when the British first started to get the idea, you know, maybe China isn't isn't so strong internally, maybe there's a situation that we can take advantage of here.
yeah. In
Uh,
fact, Lord Mackay, the British nobleman who headed the mission to seize the Channel Emperor in 1790s, he said he made a comparison. He said China is this crazy old man of war, right? When you have a capable captain like Channel Emperor at the helm, it could steer away from all the perilous rocks. But when you have someone less capable, it's just gonna smash itself into pieces and in dangerous waters. And so
yeah,
he actually traveled through the Chinese countryside. This is at the latter stage of Chandong's reign. So a lot
yeah.
of the
Qianlong died in 1799.
yeah, because Chandong ruled a long time. He ruled like 60 years. He
Yeah,
abdicated eventually because
61 years.
yeah, because his grandfather Kangxi Emperor ruled over 60 years, and he's like, okay, well, I don't want to exceed the time that
Yeah,
my
he
grandfather
he
was at
didn't want.
helm. Yeah, go ahead.
He thought that he would be showing disrespect to Kangxi Emperor if he
Yeah,
because he would have exceeded him if he'd stayed as emperor until he died in
yep.
1799. He would have
So he
exceeded his grandpa by 3 years.
no, so out of respect for his grandfather, the Kangxi Emperor, he abdicated
Yeah,
in favor of his son, and he became kind of like the power behind the throne, so to speak. And and then, but uh, just a side note, since we went on so many tangents already on the British McCartney mission to China, the common
yeah,
conventional wisdom is that China missed its chance to kind of welcome the European trade, opening up to European ideas, science, and really missed the chance to modernize with the McCartney mission. But I have to point out to people, you are looking back at this with like hindsight, 2020 hindsight. Back in
yeah,
1790s, back in 1795, 1798, that was 50 years before the Opium War. And it's also before the start of British Industrial Revolution, right? Because the
yeah,
Industrial Revolution was the really uh, game changer that tipped the balance of between the industrialized West and China. Before the industrialization, China was still the largest economy in the world, and
what,
from position of Chandong, he's right. He doesn't have any need. He doesn't need like British. He doesn't have any need for
it's
British manufacturing. He was doing the British a
it's
favor,
really
granting them
yeah,
trade,
exactly.
and it
It's
was well known that even at that time, The what British most profitable part of the British trade was bringing opium to China. I mean, there's no reason for China to show respect to the British envoy at that point, because
Yeah.
at that point the British really did not have a decisive leg up over China, because as I mentioned, the industrial revolution hasn't started yet. 50 years is a long time. By Opium War, yes, by that time British already completed its industrial revolution. There was a huge gap between the British and China, but in 1795, not so much.
Yeah.
there was, yeah, exactly. Anyway,
That
so
that
so
was
just,
that was really the start of when the British went from being just another like commercially based European power to being Great Britain.
yes,
And
yes,
it
because
all happened, as you said, in that 50 years, they went from just another player to the big fish in the big
yeah,
pond.
because
Um,
before
so
that,
it's really,
China had, like, because we're told everything from like an Anglo perspective. Because before that, China
hmm.
had dealt with Europeans. China had been trading with the
Oh,
Portuguese and
totally.
for hundreds of years, right? And
Since,
and and, and
yeah, since
Dutch.
the 1600s. Yeah.
Yeah, and the British is
Yeah.
not the old, like the channel actually received the Dutch embassy, the Russian embassy. So the Chinese have been dealing with Europeans by in 1795 with the Europeans for hundreds of years. And from their perspective, British just another it's just another one. It's like there's nothing fundamentally different from Chandong's perspective that set aside the British from the Dutch, from the Portuguese, from the Spanish, from the Russians. And
Mm.
but yeah, because Chandong couldn't tell the future. He couldn't have possibly know what would happen in the next 50 years with the Industrial Revolution in England. But anyway, so that's our
Well,
tangent. Let's
yeah. Well, we get to 1852. Like, we'll move away from China at this point. We get to
Okay, so
1852.
this is
Um,
after, so 1862. This is already after the two Opium Wars, right? So Opium War was fought in
18,
eight.
1852. This is between the Opium
Okay,
Wars.
between the Opium War. So the
Um,
first Opium
we
War
move
was fought between 1839 to 1841 or 42. I don't remember. But so
41,
1850.
41.
Yeah. So
And
1852
that's
is full.
1841 is when Hong Kong went to the Brits as well. That
Yes,
was part of the Opium War
that was the
concessions.
first Opium War. So 1852 is a full 10 years
Yeah.
after the first Opium War. It's also right around the time when Taiping Rebellion was going to break out in a major way. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. 1852 is when the British kind of started moving in on, as it was called at the time, Burma. Now, that was the name that the British called it, Burma. This is after the name of the majority ethnic group at the time, the Burma people. It's still the ethnic majority group of Myanmar. Um, but the British said, okay, well, we'll just name it after the name of the people who we're dealing with, the Burma people. That's when they started pushing a lot of opium, like industrial quantities of opium into Burma. This was coming from India again, it was coming from the same places as the opium they were pushing into China.
Yeah,
Um,
oh, just a little bit more background. By 1850s, British already consolidated their control in India, right? And now they're pushing against the border of Myanmar,
yeah,
or the Burmese Empire, because the British around the time of the Opium War and immediate afterward, they also wanted to get into the tea trade. So it was not enough that they were selling um, opiums to China to get silver, but now they also wanted to produce their own tea. So they actually sending botanic spies into China to gather like tea plant seeds, and they brought some Chinese tea workers to India, and they found out that the area most suitable for tea plantation is northeast India in Assam. So we're already on the
Yeah,
pushing against the border of Myanmar there, and so British went there. They already conquered that region like tens of years, like few decades earlier. And then they brought these Chinese tea workers to plant teas in Assam. So that's the start of like the Indian tea production, the tea
mm.
plantation of Assam, and then
Because
so that and because that area borders Myanmar, right? Myanmar actually the Burmese Empire actually went into uh, was launched several expeditions into that area earlier. So now the British territorially they're butting heads against the Burmese Empire, and then that resulted when clash, and they resulted in the Anglo-Burmese War, right? Okay, I'm done.
mm, yeah, so that's 1852 that really started. Okay, so 1856 you had the Second Opium War, and that's when opium became legal. Like that was one of the things that
That's one of the
hang on, when
demand
was
of the
that?
British
Yeah,
because the
yeah.
first
In
Opium War resulted. One of the demands for the British was for China to legalize opium trade, but China refused to budge on that issue. So the British felt they
Well,
didn't get everything.
opium had been outlawed in 1799
Yeah,
by Jia Qing, and
yeah.
then in hang on a second,
So I mean, the
first
opium
opium
ban
war.
was officially announced.
Yeah,
There were
there was
several
a
opium
Chinese. In 1839.
there were several
Yeah,
opium bans, right? So there was first during the reign of Yongzheng Emperor, and then in Qianlong Emperor's reign, and then again after in Qianlong Emperor's son Jia Qing, and then Daoguang
yeah,
Emperor
Jia Qing.
issue a even more another ban, and that
That was
ban by Daoguang Emperor that in 1830s. That's what triggered the Opium War, right? When Daoguang Emperor sent
well,
Commissioner Lin Zexu to Guangzhou to actually enforce actually enforce a ban, and that's
yeah,
when
the
the
law exactly.
yeah
Yeah, as you say, that was in March 1839.
yeah.
The
So that's what
commissioner from the imperial court, he basically he was enforcing the law. He went there and he said, "Look, you're going to have to surrender all of your opium because it's illegal, and you know it's illegal, and here you are flouting the law. You're doing business in our country. You have to surrender all of your opium because if we say to you destroy it, you're just going to hide it somewhere." And then you're going to sell it later on.
yeah
We're going to seize it and destroy it ourselves.
yeah
And in response to him enforcing the law, the British sent warships
yeah
to Canton, and that's where the first Opium War started, from
yeah
the Chinese enforcing their own laws,
yeah. And the
which is
result of First Opium War, the British one of the term British wanted was fully legalization of opium trade in China, but British didn't get that. Instead, what they get is basically the
until
total lapse in the enforcement of the law. So like opium trade was rampant, but it was still technically illegal. But British launched the second Opium War to get what they want, which is
in
actually legally,
1856. Yeah,
yeah, actually legally allow opium
yeah.
trade as
That
well.
was
Also,
that was one of the concessions after the Second Opium War. I mean,
yep,
the French got in on the party then as well.
yep, yep.
And
Because
don't forget the French.
French by that time they already moved into Vietnam, so now they have a base
Yeah,
to
Vietnam, exactly.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Now they have their
Sometimes here you find you find coinage from French Indochina. I mean, it's all fake. I mean, originally the currency was real. It's fake currency now, but you get like all these historical coins from the 1800s being sold in the markets here. And at first, I was like, French Indochina. This is like 10 years ago when I first came here. I didn't know any of the history, and that's one
Oh,
of the
you mean
things that
those were sold in Yunnan where you live? Those currencies?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Oh
yeah.
wow.
Well, reproductions.
Oh
I mean,
right, of course.
very, very occasionally you find the genuine article, but then if it's the genuine article, the people who are selling know what they have. Generally, if you're looking to buy those kind of coins, you take a magnet with you, and if the magnet attracts the coins, you can go, okay, this is a modern reproduction.
Oh,
They
so they use like they use steel, iron, or like
They,
something.
they use an iron core and then they
Okay.
put like a thin wash. It's usually
Uh,
iron and tin because then,
yeah,
tin or something that doesn't corrode so much.
yeah, yeah.
Um, but then, like, you can just go through the trays with your magnet. They don't like you doing that for some reason. Whenever I take a magnet to the
Oh,
markets to try and find genuine coins, they don't like me doing that.
okay, that's a
Anyway,
colorful anecdote. Let's get back to our drug story.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So,
So
so
I,
how opium got to northern Myanmar? So the
so
British
so
moved into Myanmar, right? And
in
then later
eighteen
they also, yeah. Go ahead.
in 1852, in 1852, the British moved into Lower Burma. So like the area where the
Okay.
Burma people really,
Live.
really, well, that's where their main
Well, okay,
population.
okay. So for people who are not familiar, at the time before the British came, the area of Myanmar is ruled by kind of the last Burmese Empire, right?
Yeah,
Empire,
Kompal dynasty. Yeah. Oh no,
yeah,
that was earlier. Sorry.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
there was
the
dynasties of
Burmese
Burmese
Empire
kings.
is an empire, whereas it's ruled by run by like the Burmese majority. The rule from in
Yeah.
southern capital in Rangoon, but it expanded north, right, into the hills. Conquering all these hill tribes, including all
But
these.
that was much
Different.
later.
I'm sorry.
That was more in the 1800s, like when they started moving into, like, for example, what is now Rakhine State or Shan or Kachin states. They were still largely independent.
Well, but they were, I mean, they pushed into those area northern Myanmar even during the Emperor Chandong's reign, right, in like 1700, because that's when that triggered the war between Qing China and Myanmar, right?
Yeah, but
Because the
but in
Burmese Empire was expanding in all directions. It was very militaristic. It expanded north south. It destroyed the old Siam, the first kingdom in Thailand. It took
yeah,
over that region, and then you went north to push into what is now today's northern Myanmar, all the way up against the Chinese border. So at the time, that area of northern Myanmar and southern Yunnan is we mentioned earlier, it's populated by different Thai-speaking people, the Jingpo people, a whole patchwork of ethnicity, and on the local level,
well,
it's run by these local kingdoms where the kings will pledge allegiance to either the Chinese Empire or the Burmese Empire. Depends on which side gets
yeah,
stronger at the moment, and
well,
but at local level, there's a lot of autonomy. These kings rule their own kingdoms. But what happened
they're more
in
like tributary
yeah,
powers. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. So
they
what
pay
happened
tribute.
with the rise of the last Burmese dynasty, the last Burmese empire, was that they start to aggressively to expand in this area to enforce their rules, and then they started to even push even against the area of Chinese influence in Yunnan, and so that's when Channel Emperor launched his invasion of Myanmar, the war between Qing Dynasty China and the Burmese Empire, and
Yeah.
that kind of temporarily settled that border. And so one half gets us allotted to what is now get allotted to the Burmese Empire. The other parts the got reaffirmed as the Chinese tributary. And
But
and then go ahead.
what I
You
want
want to
to
say?
say is there's a huge difference between the Shan and the Kachin people. The Shan people were agriculturalists in much the same way as the Han or other agricultural powers. They supported large populations.
They're
They
rice farmers.
supported kingdoms and principalities through rice cultivation. They were rice like the Dai people, the Shan people, um, may have even been the ones who introduced the Chinese, the Han, or who became the Han, to rice farming all those thousands of years ago. And so the Shan Dai areas were much more conducive to military expeditions than the Kachin Jingpo
Ah,
people,
okay.
who
Okay.
were
Who are
they were living in hills, mountains, rainforests.
okay. That
They
that that makes sense.
practiced
That makes
swimming.
sense. That makes sense
They
because when the
practiced.
that makes sense because the 1700 war between Qing Dynasty China and Burmese Empire was really over the Dai areas, like you said, the
Yeah.
valleys where the
Well,
rice are planted, and those are the in the Sun
and,
State and in Yunnan. Yes, yes, that makes sense.
that's a big difference in how the wars went. That like when the Han were fighting against the Burmese and the Shan, they they all had the same general idea of warfare and fighting, and they were organized in much the same way, except that obviously the Chinese side had more troops, more infrastructure, all of that kind of thing.
Yeah, I have to
So
correct you a second, Davide. So during the Qing
okay,
Dynasty war with Myanmar, it's not just Han troops because there was the
yeah,
obviously there were Manchu troops, and
yeah,
in
of
fact at
course,
the time the Channel Emperor deployed troops all the way from Manchuria, from Heilongjiang, what is today
from
Heilongjiang
all over
Province.
the empire, yeah,
But
that's
many
true.
of them he sent from the so-called the new Manchu. So these are the people who were conquered by the Manchus in northern Manchuria on what is
Oh,
today
uh,
Sino-Russian border, like along the river, along the Amur River, right in the Amur River Valley. So these today will be
yeah.
the called the Dawar people, the Evenkis, the
Oh, Evanks, yeah, okay.
yeah, and what's the other? I'm drawing a blank here, but there's three. But anyway, so these people, from far northern Manchuria on the border of
Yeah.
Amur River, they were drafted by Channel Emperor to fight in Myanmar, because they were
Yeah.
hardy warriors, and actually the Burmese were in fear of them because they're very good horse archers. But the
Mm.
problem is these far northern people, they come to really hot tropical jungle in Myanmar. They
Yeah.
die from disease. They drop like flies from the tropical
And
disease.
that was
And that
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 was
was
a
one of the biggest casualties of the Qing troops
yeah,
is from
totally malaria. Yeah,
malaria.
exactly.
Yeah, from
Um,
malaria. So
and that was
so
a big
right.
thing with the fighting in Kachin, Jingpo areas, that they lived in a totally different ecosystem. They didn't have the massive population that the rice farming ethnic groups had, and so their way of making war was much more like what we would currently call guerrilla warfare. That individually they were stronger than like your Shan people or whoever else. So individually they were very strong, and they were accustomed to fighting in small skirmish groups, and they were accustomed to fighting against the Shan, against the Bama. So they were very, that you make a raid with a small amount of warriors, kill a few people, melt away into the hills, into the jungle, and just rather than making these big blows that your mass armies are accustomed to making, they would do more like a slow bleed sort of style of warfare.
So for my
And
American audience, think of Native Americans around the time of European arrival. That kind of a
except
warfare.
except that there was no technology gap, because
Yeah.
the Kachin, as well as living in this manner, were also incredibly rich, because in their land, in Kachin state, there's all the jade, all the rubies, all the emeralds, like just this lots of hardwood, lots of really valuable woods. Um, and that's still the case today. That and so they were incredibly
So for
wealthy,
people
and
who
whenever they
I encourage people to take a look at a map of northern Myanmar and also Yunnan. So in northern Myanmar, the two largest states is Kachin State and the San State. The Kachin State is to the west of Yunnan. It's like this teardrop shaped that's just like poking through, like I'd say at the crown of Myanmar, right? And then the San State is a little bit to the south of Kachin State. It's more to the east, right? And so if you use China's Yunnan province as reference, Kachin State would be to the west of Yunnan, whereas San State would be more directly to the south of Yunnan. Is that does that is
yeah,
that yeah,
exactly.
okay. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
So that's how we, if we want to go to Shan State, well, we're not going anywhere now because there's like an incipient civil war going on in Myanmar. But if we want to go to Shan State from here in Yunnan, in Dehong, we go directly south. If we want to go to Kachin State, we have to go northwest to Baoshan Prefecture, and then from Baoshan Prefecture we can cross over into Kachin State in Myanmar. So yeah, it's as you say, the geographical relation between the three places is much like that, and also Kachin State is getting further into the Himalaya foothills. Like you go to North Kachin State, and that's really getting into what you would call the Himalayas, as opposed to here, which is very much. And we're still 1,000 meters above sea level here, and that's at the base of the valley floor. But it's not anything like the altitude of large parts of Kachin State or anything like that.
Yeah, the
Uh,
area of northern Myanmar and also Yunnan is very geographically diverse, and
yeah,
you have, if you think about the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayas, it kind of spill over into this area by through and cut across by different great rivers, by like the Yangtze, the Mekong, the Salween River, right? They cut across into deep river valleys. So this area, part of Southeast Asia, so I think some refer as Zumia. So there's a new term called Zumia. This very mountainous region, but that has some very deep river valleys. Where on the bottom, you have rice cultivations, but then you have different people, living as hunter gatherers, more up in the mountains. So it's very geographically, ethnic, linguistically diverse region.
Yeah. The Shan languages and the Kachin languages are nothing alike. They're not even from the same language group. Um, they're completely unrelated to each other.
Yeah.
And you have a lot of languages that are related to each other, like you've got
Okay.
Burmese language, Shan language, Thai language are all part of the same language group. Kachin
We we
language is totally different.
we really took a long arc of
Oh my
tangent. So
god.
let's get back to the drugs. Like our drugs narrative. That's what ties everything together, right?
This is
So
this is what we started off on, yeah.
yeah,
Well,
yeah, yeah.
I wanna get to that. Okay,
Okay.
so basically, Kachin, basically the British. Let me see. I need to work my way back to where I was before.
So basically, I got
So as I
distracted.
said, like 1850s, the British arrived in Lower Burma, so like like the Burma heartland. In the next,
Okay, so finally, we are finally getting to the meat of our investigation of this particular history, the history of opium and heroin in Southeast Asia. Uh, I thank everyone for following us along on this journey. I hope it was interesting and entertaining for everyone. I know me and Davide had fun recording this. I just hope you had equal amount of fun listening. So please comment, leave a comment, click like. I'm gonna have the in-depth historical part be available for my patrons on my Patreon website, which is just go to www.patreon.com/ what is this slash silk and as in Nancy and Steel. Silk and Steel, and or just go to Patreon.com and search Silk.
Carl Jar.
Yeah, go search Carl Zhao or search Silk. It should be the first page that pops up. So
Yeah,
and
that's what happens for me.
we where can people find you, Davide?
Okay, so if people want to catch up with my work from here in southeast Yunnan, in southwest Yunnan, in southwest China, I should say, they can go over to patreon.com/Southwest China. That's Southwest China, one word, no abbreviation. Yeah, I have hundreds of picture galleries, essays, videos. There's no end of content over there, and if your subscribers would like to learn more about this part of China, I can't think of a better source for modern day anyway. So yeah, I would strongly encourage them to head over to my Patreon and subscribe today.
Yeah, check out the Davide's Patreon site, subscribe. And next time when we have Davide back, we will talk about the start of the CIA financed drug trade in northern Myanmar.
The CIA was like Hans Brinker. They had their thumbs in all kinds of schemes and plots in Myanmar at that time, and we'll be going into a lot of that stuff next time. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's a lot of fascinating stuff. So again, thanks to everyone for listening. Until next time, bye bye.
Bye bye.